I've spent years in the woods as a park ranger, but nothing prepared me for the night. I realized something massive was watching me from the shadows and screaming just for me. I started working as a seasonal park ranger in Southern Oregon back in 2016. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid the bills and gave me something to do after leaving my job in construction. I'd always loved the outdoors, and being alone in quiet places was something I enjoyed more than most people would. Wolf Creek Campground wasn't exactly a tourist hotspot, even during summer. It sat at the edge of a forest preserve that stretched for miles, with logging trails cutting through the ridges like veins. By the time autumn rolled around, there would be weeks where not a single camper showed up. That kind of silence didn't bother me. It was almost peaceful. Almost. It was late September, maybe a week before the park was due to close for the season, when things started getting strange. I was staying in the ranger cabin, a one-room wooden structure with a small porch, about half a mile from the main campground. My job that week was mostly inspection, checking the sites, clearing fallen branches, making sure no one had left trash behind. Every night, I'd radio the district office around 9 p.m. to confirm my log entries, then go to bed. Simple routine. The first night I noticed something off. It was around 11:30. I was lying in bed, half asleep, when I heard what I thought was a person screaming somewhere out in the woods. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either, maybe half a mile off toward the creek. The sound was high-pitched, raw and long, the kind of noise that cut straight through the air. My first thought was that maybe a camper had stayed late or someone had gotten hurt. I grabbed my flashlight, jacket, and radio and stepped outside. The forest was quiet except for the wind pushing through the trees. I called out over the radio, checking if any hikers had checked, and that day, nothing. I waited, listening. Then, after maybe 30 seconds, the scream came again. Same pitch, same drawn-out tone. Too far for me to pinpoint direction, but close enough to feel unnatural. I decided to wait until morning to check it out. I'd been told before that mountain lions could make noises that sound almost human, and that area had plenty of them. Still, something about it didn't sit right. The next morning, I headed down toward the creek to check the perimeter. I didn't find any footprints or camping debris, just some bent branches and flattened grass like something large had moved through. The forest floor there was soft with pine needles, so prints didn't always hold well. But whatever had gone through that area had done it with weight. I noted in my report and moved on. For the next 2 nights, things were quiet again. No screams, no movement, nothing. I'd almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. Then, on the 4th night, the sound returned, but much closer. I was sitting at my desk filling out a maintenance report when it started. Same kind of scream, but this time it came from somewhere near the first campsite, maybe 200 yards from my cabin. I froze. It wasn't just loud, it was deep. It started high and ended low, like a growl buried under a human voice. I turned off the lantern inside and waited. The forest went silent again for maybe 2 minutes. Then I heard movement. Not twigs snapping or leaves rustling. Something heavy walking through wet soil. I stood by the window, watching the dark. My flashlight beam wasn't powerful enough to cut through the trees that far, but I could feel it out there. That sense of being watched, of something standing just beyond the edge of your light. I waited another 5 minutes, maybe longer, until the footsteps faded toward the creek. I didn't go after it. I wrote the time down, noted unknown animal vocalization and movement near Site 1, and tried to sleep. The next morning, I checked that site. The fire ring was scattered. The picnic table had been dragged a few feet out of place, and the dirt around it was disturbed. No human tracks, no tire marks, nothing like that. But behind the campsite, in the mud near the creek's edge, I found prints, massive ones. They weren't boot treads or bare prints. They were too long, too narrow, with a clear arch and what looked like defined toes. The stride distance between each was nearly 4 feet apart. I stood there staring at them for a long time, longer than I should have. I'd seen tracks before from bears, elk, moose, but nothing like this. I measured one roughly with my boot, size 11, and it was easily twice as long. It didn't make sense. I took photos, but my phone camera barely captured the outline before the glare washed most of it out. I marked the spot and kept moving, trying not to think about it. That day, I hiked to the upper ridge, where a set of motion cameras had been installed for wildlife monitoring. I wanted to check if any had caught movement in the nights prior. When I pulled the memory cards and checked them back at the cabin that evening, most clips were of raccoons, deer, or wind-triggered movement. But one video, timestamped around 11:42 p.m. 2 nights earlier, showed something I couldn't explain. The frame was angled toward the tree line above the creek. For about 6 seconds, a tall, dark figure passed between 2 trees. It wasn't moving like an animal. It was walking upright. No visible light reflection from eyes. No shape that matched anything I knew. I replayed it maybe 10 times. The figure's head nearly reached the lowest branches of the trees it passed under. Those trees were at least 8 feet high where the limbs started. I didn't sleep that night. Every small noise outside felt amplified. The wind, branches creaking, the soft scrape of pine cones rolling down the roof. At one point I thought I heard breathing outside the window, a low rhythmic exhale like someone standing just beyond the wall. I stayed perfectly still until dawn. By morning, nothing was there, but behind the cabin, near the old supply shed, I found the door hanging open. I hadn't used it in weeks, and I always kept it latched. Inside, some tools were missing. A heavy wrench, a crowbar, a coil of rope. I didn't see any signs of forced entry. No scratches or prying marks. The only thing unusual was the smell. It was faint, but distinct, musky, like wet fur mixed with rot. Not the smell of a dead animal, but of something that hadn't bathed or cleaned itself in a long time. It lingered even after I stepped outside. That afternoon, I called my supervisor at the district office and explained what I'd found. He said he'd drive out in 2 days to check things over, but until then, to stay alert and document everything. 2 days felt like forever. That night, I set up my own small camera on the cabin porch, aimed toward the trail. I didn't expect much, but by then, I'd already accepted that whatever was happening around Wolf Creek wasn't just typical wildlife. I spent most of the next day trying to focus on my duties, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted out there. The woods had a stillness that wasn't normal. Birds didn't sound the same. The breeze felt heavier, and the air seemed to carry an odor that didn't belong. Faint but persistent, a damp, earthy smell like wet animal fur and soil turned over by large feet. I caught myself checking over my shoulder constantly as I worked. Even the usual forest sounds felt distant, as if muffled by something thick in the air. I made my morning rounds, visited the upper ridge, and reset one of the motion cameras I'd checked the day before. The batteries were fine. The memory card was secure, but the angle of the camera had changed slightly, tilted downward. Someone, or something, had touched it. The metal pole it was mounted on was bent, not snapped, but pushed hard enough to warp it. It takes a lot of force to do that, more than a person could manage without tools. I didn't see any prints in the mud below, but the ground was churned up like something heavy had been moving there. Back at the cabin, I wrote a detailed entry in the logbook, trying to sound objective. My supervisor always stressed the importance of keeping reports factual. Avoid speculation was something he drilled into every ranger. I wrote, camera post bent at base, probable large animal disturbance, possible elk or bear. But I didn't believe it. No bear walks upright in front of a camera and moves a metal pole without leaving claw marks. By mid-afternoon, a storm started rolling in from the west. Low clouds swallowed the ridges, and the forest went dark fast. I spent the evening organizing supplies inside the cabin: flashlights, first aid, spare radio batteries, and my old 12 gauge that was issued years ago for wildlife control. I didn't like carrying it unless absolutely necessary, but something about that night made me want it within reach. Around 8, the wind picked up. It wasn't violent, but it came in steady gusts that made the trees creak and sway. The rain followed soon after, light at first, then heavy. I remember sitting by the window, watching sheets of water fall across the clearing. The tree lined a moving wall of black behind it. When lightning flashed, for just a split second, I saw something large standing near the tree-line. It wasn't moving, just there as if watching. But by the next flash, it was gone. I didn't move for a while after that. My body felt tight, like I was waiting for confirmation that what I saw was real. Maybe it was a tree trunk, maybe a shadow. I told myself that, but something inside me knew better. I turned off the lantern and sat there in the dark with the shotgun resting across my knees, listening. The rain hammered the roof, drowning out most other sounds. But between the gusts, I could hear it, faint, irregular thumps, like footfalls moving somewhere near the porch. At one point, something brushed against the outer wall. Just a single drag, maybe of a hand or a body, sliding past wooden boards. Then silence. I held my breath for what felt like minutes. I didn't go outside, not that night. I waited until dawn. When the rain stopped, the first light crept through in a dull gray glow. I went out, still gripping the shotgun, and checked around the cabin. There were prints in the mud again, larger than the ones by the creek, deeper too, as if whatever made them had stood there for a long time. They started near the supply shed and ended at the porch steps. One print sat perfectly in line with the edge of the first step, toes pointed directly toward the door. I don't know why that detail bothered me so much, but it did. It wasn't random movement. It was purposeful. The rest of the day, I couldn't think straight. I cleaned the same tools twice, rewrote parts of my report, checked the perimeter more times than needed. I even caught myself talking out loud, just to break the silence. Every time the wind moved the trees, I'd tense up. Every sound outside became suspect. Around noon, I drove my utility truck down the service road to the main gate. It's about a 40-minute drive each way, just to see if there were any fresh tire tracks or hikers' footprints near the entrance. Nothing. No signs anyone had been through for days. I stopped halfway back, turned off the engine, and just listened. The forest at midday should be alive with insects, distant calls, the chatter of squirrels, but it was dead quiet. I've never heard silence like that in the wilderness. It wasn't peaceful, it was suffocating. When I got back to the cabin, something was off. My front door was closed, but the latch was unhooked. I always hook it from inside before leaving. Inside, my desk chair was tipped over. A few papers scattered across the floor. The shotgun was still leaning where I'd left it, but the shelled box beside it was open. I hadn't opened it. Nothing else was missing, but there was another smell inside, stronger this time. Musky, almost sweet, with a sour undertone like old meat. It clung to the air, heavy enough to make me gag a little. I propped the door open to air the place out, but it lingered for hours. I checked the camera on the porch, the one I'd set the previous night. It was still recording, battery intact. I didn't watch it immediately. I wasn't sure I wanted to. By sunset, the forest started darkening again, and I felt that same tension return, that same invisible pressure that seemed to settle around the cabin each night now. I decided to make a fire in the pit outside, not for cooking, but for light. I figured maybe it would keep whatever was out there at a distance. The flames threw long shadows against the trees, and the smoke drifted into the cool air. For the first hour, everything stayed quiet. Then, not long after 10, I heard the first sound, a deep, guttural moan echoing from far down near the creek. It wasn't a scream this time, not like before. It was lower, drawn out, almost like something communicating. A few minutes later, another sound answered from somewhere up the ridge. That was when I realized there might be more than one. The sounds grew closer, alternating between the two directions, like they were moving toward each other and toward me. I grabbed my radio and tried calling the office, but the signal was dead. That wasn't unusual in storms or in low valleys, but it felt deliberate now, like I'd been cut off. I doused the fire halfway and went back inside, locking the door. I moved one of the chairs against it out of instinct, though I knew it wouldn't do much. The noise outside grew louder, heavy movement through brush, branches snapping, the occasional deep grunt. Then something hit the cabin wall hard enough to rattle the lantern on my desk. Just one impact, like a massive fist slamming wood. I stayed completely still. The breathing outside started again, slow and rough, with short huffs like air forced through a wide chest. Then the smell returned, that thick, damp odor of musk and rot, seeping through the cracks in the boards. I thought about shooting through the wall, but I didn't know what direction to aim. After several minutes, the sounds faded. I waited another hour before moving. When I finally checked the porch camera footage, the timestamp matched exactly when I'd heard the impact. The screen was mostly static from the rain, but for a split second before the lens was knocked sideways, a massive silhouette filled the frame, taller than the doorway, wide, completely covered in dark, matted fur. You could see part of an arm, long enough that it nearly touched the porch railing as it turned. Then the screen went black. I didn't sleep at all that night. When dawn came, I stepped outside to inspect the damage. The railing was splintered, and muddy prints ran along the ground toward the tree line. The prints weren't just big, they were massive. Some nearly 18 inches long, 5 across at the ball. The stride distance was unbelievable. Near the edge of the clearing, I noticed something else. A broken branch hanging from a pine about 9 feet up, freshly snapped. Whatever had been standing there the night before was tall enough to reach it without effort. I followed the tracks only for a short distance before I stopped. They led down toward the creek, where the ground turned soft and swallowed the impressions. I could see where something large had waded into the shallow water, disturbing the stones beneath. But there were no prints leading out on the other side. That day, I wrote the longest log entry I've ever written. I described everything: the sounds, the smell, the prints, the camera footage, even my own reaction. It filled 4 pages of the notebook. I sealed the SD card in a small evidence bag and stored it in my locker. My supervisor was due the next morning. I told myself if I made it through one more night, I'd have someone else to confirm what I'd seen. By the time the last daylight drained from the sky, I had fully accepted that I wasn't dealing with any normal kind of animal. The storm that had rolled in during the afternoon had now moved further east, leaving the forest heavy with mist and dripping branches. The campground felt like it had been forgotten by the world, empty, cold, and strangely alive in a way that made me want to keep my flashlight off, just so nothing would notice me. I sat inside my truck for a long while after sunset, listening. The forest was quiet again, but it wasn't a natural quiet. It was that same stretched silence from before, like the woods were waiting for something. I kept my window cracked just enough to hear, and every so often there was the faintest sound, branches shifting, like something large was brushing against them carefully. The smell that drifted through that small opening was still there too, earthy, wet, and almost rotten. I didn't move for nearly an hour. I just sat there, watching the tree line with the faint glow from my dashboard clock, marking the slow passage of time. At some point, I started to drift in and out, half dozing with my hand still resting on my flashlight. I woke suddenly when the truck rocked. Not a strong movement, just a gentle bump, as though something had brushed against the back corner. I stayed frozen. My first thought was that it might have been the wind, but there was no breeze. Then I heard it, a slow, deep exhale near the driver's side window. It wasn't the sound of a person. It was too long, too steady, and carried a weight that made the hairs rise on the back of my neck. I turned my head just slightly and caught the faint outline of a large shape standing beside the truck. The window was fogged on the inside, but even through that I could make out the width of its upper body. It didn't move for several seconds. Then it did something that I still can't fully explain. It leaned close enough that the window flexed slightly inward, and I could see the condensation spreading where it breathed against the glass. Its height had to have been 7, maybe 8 feet. When it stepped away, the truck rocked again, lighter this time, and then there was silence. I sat there, every muscle locked. I didn't reach for my gun because I knew that if I did anything sudden, whatever it was might take that as a threat. So I waited. I kept my breathing shallow and counted seconds in my head. Eventually, I heard slow, deliberate steps moving toward the trees, each one heavier than a man's, but oddly controlled, like it knew how to move quietly. Once the sound faded into the woods, I started the engine. I wanted to get out of there, but a small part of me needed to see where it had gone. I kept the headlights off and slowly rolled forward along the dirt loop road, scanning with my flashlight through the side window. I saw impressions in the wet mud, massive, human-like prints spaced farther apart than any person could manage. They led off behind Site 6 toward the ridge. I followed on foot for a short distance, staying just close enough to see the shapes of the prints. That's when I noticed something else. The forest floor was disturbed as if multiple smaller animals had moved through in a hurry, all heading away from the same direction. Birds weren't calling, frogs weren't croaking. Everything that usually fills the night had gone silent again. I couldn't shake the feeling that the creature was still nearby, watching. At around 2 in the morning, I returned to my truck and decided I'd head back to the ranger station before dawn. I knew I couldn't just leave without logging what I'd seen, but I also didn't trust that the thing was gone. Driving down that narrow gravel road was nerve-wracking. Every shadow beyond the reach of my headlights seemed too solid, and the mist made the forest look endless. About halfway back, I noticed movement in my rearview mirror. A shape, dark and tall, was keeping pace behind the truck for several seconds at a time before disappearing. I slowed once, thinking maybe my tired eyes were playing tricks, but the shape reappeared again, this time closer. It wasn't running exactly. It moved in a kind of swift, gliding stride that made no sound on the gravel. I pressed the accelerator, my hands gripping the wheel tighter than I realized. It didn't follow after that. When I finally reached the ranger station, it was almost dawn. The world was starting to lighten, and for the first time that night, the forest began to sound normal again. Birds were chirping. The air felt open, and that suffocating pressure that had hung around the campground was gone. I made a full report to the district supervisor later that morning. I left out the part about seeing a massive figure beside my truck, because I knew exactly how that would sound. I stuck to what could be proven. The tracks, the smell, the strange calls, and the fact that large sections of the forest floor looked like they'd been disturbed by something heavy. A team was sent to inspect the area later that week, but by then the tracks were gone. They said it was probably a bear. I didn't argue. For the next few months, I worked other stations, lower elevation sites, places where you could hear traffic in the distance or see lights on the horizon. But every time I looked at the assignment board and saw Wolf Creek still listed, my stomach would tighten. I never went back there. I've told the story only a handful of times, usually to other rangers who've seen or heard things they can't explain. Most of them just nod and say there are places in those woods that don't belong to people, and I think they're right.